hello, and welcome back to AOPA's Pilot Information Center Livestream webinar series. Our topic for this episode is 3 routes to Alaska. I'm Ferdi Mack with AOPA's Pilot Information Center, and thanks for joining us. This is the second in a series of Livestream episodes in 2018, covering the broad topic of fun flying. This webinar is brought to you by our Pilot Information Center. If you have any general aviation questions, or perhaps a specific question on Alaskan flying, or for that matter, medical certification or AOPA online product support, you can contact us with your questions at 800-872-2672. That's 800-USA-AOPA, Monday through Friday, 8:30 a.m. through 6 p.m. Eastern Time. We can also email your questions to us at pilotassist@aopa.org. Joining us today is Tom George. Tom is AOPA's Regional Manager in Alaska, also a very experienced Alaska flyer, and he was kind enough to come visit us here in Maryland to participate in this webinar. Welcome, Tom. Great to see you.
Pleasure to be here.
Excellent. Also with us is Dave Hirschman, who you may recognize from our first episode of our Fun Flying, where we covered tailwheel flying. Dave is an AOPA editor-at-large in our media department, and he's been to Alaska, but as opposed to being overly experienced, is overly enthusiastic. So we've got a good blend of of verve here, basically. And finally, you're also one of AOPA's CFIs. Welcome, Dave.
Thanks, glad to be here.
Excellent. So let's get started. As part of our registration process for this webinar, we sent out a link to a survey asking registrants a few simple questions in order to gauge our audience. As of a short while ago, we had almost 300 respondents, and 77% of them said they had not flown a GA aircraft to Alaska. And keep in mind, what we're going to be covering here is how to get to Alaska. So 77% of them not having done that, that will help us target what we're going to cover this evening. However, of the pilots who have flown to Alaska from the lower 48, 41 have flown the Alaska Highway, 23 have flown the Trench, and 21 have flown the coastal route. Not sure what those things are? Well, I wasn't either, but we're about to tell you. Finally, in the survey, we had an open-ended question asking what topics you'd like us to cover, and the list included broadly weather, planning, options, the safest route, and places to stop. All right, gentlemen, where should we get started this evening?
Well, I think we should start with the big picture of kind of what are the 3 routes we're going to talk about, and why might one choose one over the other of those. Mm-hmm. So I know we've defined 3 routes: the Alcan Highway, which is what people often talk about when they are discussing flying to Alaska. Another route that provides a bit of a shortcut depending on where you're coming from is the Trench. Mm-hmm. And we'll go over that and some of the terrain involved. And then for the bold and daring, there's flying the coast, which you need good weather and perhaps a few other things.
Sounds like the coast would be the easiest, but not the case necessarily.
We'll get to that.
Wonderful, wonderful. So I misspoke. I said Alaskan Highway. It's the Alcan Highway.
Alaska Highway or Alaska Canadian Alcan Highway.
Okay.
Either one works.
Okay. So how do we dive into that?
So I guess let's talk about the Alcan first, because that's probably the most typical. But actually, we should talk a little bit about why you might pick one over the other. And of course, one factor is where are you coming from. If you're coming from the east or from Montana, then heading up the Alcan route might make a lot of sense. If you're coming straight off of the west coast, the Trench is quite a bit more direct. And again, also off the west coast, there's the coastal route, which I think weather-wise provides the most challenges. One reason it's popular is that it allows you to do it nonstop and avoid customs into Canada and then returning back into the U.S. when you enter Alaska. Mm-hmm. So those are kind of the range of things that you need to consider, and then you get into what kind of aircraft you're flying as to whether you can go VFR or IFR. I think we're going to talk mostly about VFR operations today, and probably a few other factors I haven't thought about. Anything, right, Dave, that jumps to mind?
Well, just a few numbers. It's like the coastal route is significantly shorter. I mean, it's 520 nautical miles from Bellingham to Ketchikan, and then the trench route's about 1,300 nautical miles from from Spokane, Washington to like Northway, Alaska, the first place you can in Alaska to land. And then the highway is about 200 additional miles, about 1,500 miles from Great Falls, Montana to Northway, Alaska again. So and they're all very distinct in their character. I've flown piston engine, single engine piston GA airplanes on each of the routes, and I'd character in a word if you'd characterize the highway route is boring. it's really
long.
It's really long. It's prairie. It's fairly monotonous. It's fairly dull. But at the same time, it's low elevations, and the distances between stops is relatively short. The trench route is alpine. It's mountains. It's gorgeous. And the elevations there are surprisingly low. You don't have to have a turbocharged airplane to do this. You can if you wanted to, you could fly 4,000 or 5,000 feet and get through the trench just fine. But the drawbacks are there's a little more weather involved, and the distances between the stops can be pretty significant. I think from Watson Lake to Mackenzie is about 375, a little shy of 400 nautical miles. And that doesn't sound like a huge amount, but there are very few landing opportunities in between and very little fuel in between. You can't really count on any. And then the coastal route it is spectacular. It's, on a clear day, you fly up the Inside Passage, the same sort of route that a lot of the cruise ships go up and down, and it is, you'll depending on the time of year, you'll see whales and salmon fishing boats, tremendous mountains, snow-capped glaciers, but you are exposed. It's especially single-engine piston plane. The terrain is rough, the landing opportunities are few and far between. The distance of 520 nautical miles is significant, and you've got to factor in headwinds, reserves. It doesn't sound that daunting as a number. You might look at your POH and say, "Oh, my plane can easily do 520." But when you're in the thick of things, there's just a lot more to contend with, and usually there's, even in summertime, you've got to go to some fairly high elevations to clear terrain, and the possibilities for airframe icing are real, even no matter the time of the year.
And I'd add just one more thing, actually, if we can look at that coastal map again and the big picture before we jump into each route individually. Generally, the prevailing weather is coming in off the coast and from the southwest. So if you're dealing with a weather pattern like that, of course, you're going to get clobbered the most on the coast, and the further east you go, the more the weather had to go over some higher terrain and kind of wrings a lot of the moisture out of it. So when weather's a factor, often the Alcan route, which, the longest, but it may also be the driest. So that's kind of another factor to look at. But also we can mix and match. We're going to talk about 3 routes, and you can change in midstream. You get partway up and the weather's not working in one area, you can go to another one. So even though we're talking about 3 routes, remember it's airplanes, they can go any number of places. And so kind of consider these routes as guidelines, and what you do on your individual trip, you can mix and match as weather and your interest dictates.
One word about mixing and matching, though, it's like, be careful what you decide, because on one of my trips I was in Juneau and I thought, well, the weather's terrible along the coast, I'm going to hop inland. Let's just go to the highway route. That can't be that far. And you look at it on the map, and it's like, it's true. It's like, okay, from Juneau to Watson Lake, that's several hundred miles, but it's like, hey, this plane will do several hundred miles. And the elevations aren't that high. The tops of the mountain ranges there are 7,000 feet, and it's like, hey, I'm in a normally aspirated Citabria. This thing will go well past 7,000. but the remoteness of the terrain is just unbelievable once you're going from a place like Juneau, hopping over those mountains, going to the inland route. And I remember years ago reading about the disappearance of Congressman Boggs and this well-known accident in the early 70s where a Cessna 310, he was in a Cessna 310 with some other VIPs, and they were reported 30 minutes out of Juneau, and then they were, their airplane was lost and they were never heard from again. And they launched a massive search for them, and never found a trace. And then and I remember reading about that, just thinking, how incompetent must these searchers be that they can't find you draw a 30-minute circle around Juneau and you can't find anything. And then when you fly that area, you realize it's like, wow, now I understand. There are glaciers and crevasses and just harsh, unrelenting territory that it's like if an airplane went down, it might never ever be found, and that's a totally reasonable expectation.
And a result of that accident is the ELT that we carry in our aircraft today. That was the accident that drove the ELT rule. So, well, I think we ought to actually start talking about a little more specifics of the routes themselves. So we'll focus actually a little bit, I think, on each one of these routes and a few details of them. Obviously, in a mere hour, we can't talk about the whole thing, but why don't we start with the Alcan route itself? And the Alcan, the so-called Alaska Highway, actually starts at Dawson Creek, which is about halfway up the lines that we've got drawn here on the charts, and again, it's in the prairie, as Dave's mentioned already, which is kind of flat and boring, unless, of course, weather's a factor, in which case it's very nice. Where it starts to get mountainous is leaving Fort Nelson, headed northwest toward Watson Lake. And I believe we have a visual to show that route. And the detail that I would draw to people's attention here is that the Alcan Highway itself is the yellow line there that goes wandering off into the higher terrain. And if the weather will allow it all, I would certainly recommend trying to take a more direct route to Watson Lake, which will put you on the Liard River about halfway through, which gives you a low route through the terrain to follow. So if you actually are going to follow the Alcan Highway itself, you need to be pretty careful because it'll lead you into some things that, if you're not paying attention, are essentially box canyons that you could find yourself not able to make it out of. Other than that, from there on north, generally the road does follow open valley route. So if the weather's not good enough to cut direct, like to Whitehorse or direct on into Kluane Lake and then into Alaska, following the highway is the low terrain route and the safest and best way to go. So that, I think that at least is all I had to say about that particular route on the way up.
Right. Just a quick anecdote. It's on a trip a couple years ago. I remember, had been dealing with weather and lack of fuel along the route and all sorts of unforeseen obstacles, and finally got to Fort Nelson, and I thought, man, this is great. I slept in a hotel room. It was wonderful, and I got up that morning just thinking that man, I've got it licked now. I'm southbound. I've done all the hard stuff. I'm going to get a hot meal, and I'm going to get some cash because I had spent all my cash buying avgas in remote areas where there was no ATM. So I had to pay cash up front, and walked in the hotel lobby and just think, all right, I'm going to get a good meal for the first time in days. And the entire hotel went dark at that exact moment, and the generator on that side of town was out, and was going to stay out half the day. And I thought, okay, no cash, no hot meal, let's get on the road, and that was my memorable event from Fort Nelson.
So the end of this trip, then, at least the segment we're going to talk about, is when you actually arrive at the Alaska border, and the first port of entry is Northway, which is still another 40, 50 miles inside the Canadian border. and a nice paved runway that you can clear customs. Unfortunately, today you can't buy gas at Northway, so you'll have to proceed further in to refuel. Okay, now we're looking at kind of a series of slides. This is coming in through Showers into Watson Lake. This is what a typical stretch of the Alaska Highway looks like. Kluane Lake, so you're either following lakes or braided rivers as you get closer to Alaska. There are CARS stations, which is a kind of a local flight service station at some of the Canadian stations. And then finally, this is the airport at Northway, where you can clear customs but not actually refuel. And I would recommend, if at all possible, trying to clear customs here, because the next options are several hundred miles, a couple hundred miles further away. So you're exposing yourself to weather and a lot of pressures if you wait to clear customs to get to either Fairbanks or Anchorage. So that's a kind of quick look at the Alcan route itself. I think the route we were going to talk about next is the trench. And we've shown on our route map here the trench, but the trench normally is really considered to be the segment pretty much from Prince George, and then with Mackenzie being the last regular airport with fuel available before you get to Watson Lake. And as I think Dave mentioned a little bit ago, that's a 340, 350 nautical mile stretch that you need to be prepared to operate in. What makes it daunting and so it takes off initially out of Williston Lake. You follow this man-made lake for the first 100 miles out of Mackenzie. When you run out of lake, which will be the next frame, you're actually entering then this mountain valley, which is wide open, and it's very easy to navigate. You get in this valley and just keep motoring on through. And actually, I think then we've got some shots of some of the sequences along the way. But weather is a significant factor here. The Canadians, though, like in Alaska, have some weather cameras that you can go online, and we're showing actually the FAA's interface to weather cameras here, and allow you to actually, in addition to reading forecasts for the couple of Met stations along the way, actually get a look at what current conditions are within the last 10 minutes to make a go, no-go decision when you're contemplating that route. Because as Dave mentioned earlier, this is a more remote area. It's not just following conventional roads and railroads. There are some airstrips, places you could land, but you probably won't find gas at most of them. This is actually in the mountain valley of the trench and actually heading downstream now toward Mackenzie. On your display, this is what it might look like. You definitely have terrain on both sides of you. On the north side is Scoop Lake, which if you're having trouble with it, weather, that's a good place to land and get shelter. But the end of it is Watson Lake right here, which is fuel and nice runways and flight service information. So that's a quick look at that. And again, the significant factor there is it's a pretty much single long hop. It's a little challenging to figure out the weather to make sure that you've got the range to do it and good enough weather conditions to make it in one hop. You don't have a lot of alternates that you can run to.
You know, and when people ask about the trench, they often think, boy, it sounds really narrow. You know, have I got room to turn around once I'm in the trench? And the sense you get from those pictures is accurate. It's it's 15, 20 miles wide in places, so it's easy to turn around. There's lots of room to maneuver in there, and the elevations are surprisingly low.
The pass in there, I looked it up, it's about 2,900 feet is the actual terrain that you've got to cross to go over. So yeah, it's not a high mountain pass situation.
Right, and you've got tall mountains on either side, but it's not like you're in a mountain pass that you're committed to, to going forward no matter what. There's plenty of room to turn around. And the 350-mile leg from between Watson Lake and Mackenzie, it doesn't sound like that much. Once again, it's like 350 miles. That's a couple hours in most of the airplanes we fly, and most of the airplanes we fly, it can go, a couple hours past that. But on a trip last year from southbound through the trench, in a Aviat Husky, which is a very, very capable airplane, carries 50 gallons of gas, burns about 10 an hour, easy math, 5 hours range. This particular one had big Tundra tires on it, so it was a little slower than most. and at about halfway through down the trench, picked up these amazing headwinds. 40 knot headwinds. The ground speed was 50 knots at times, and it leads you to some kind of strange considerations, because I happen to have a fuel bladder in the back of the airplane with 12 gallons of avgas, but you start to think, well, does this call for a precautionary landing in which you land somewhere, shut down, hop out, pour the gas into the tanks, and continue on? And if you do that, where are you going to do it? You saw the picture of some of these unimproved gravel strips that are there, but you don't know about you don't have any information on the condition of those strips. And this particular plane, it could landed on a sandbar. It's easy to it could take off and land in very little distance. But then you wonder, it's like, okay, if I shut down and then for some reason I can't restart, then you're in this real survival sort of situation. And so you confront these sorts of calculations that are kind of unique to the area, that even in many years of flying in the continental U.S. that you just would never encounter.
A whole new set of considerations on your decision-making flowchart.
True, and there's just calculations that it's like, wow, I hadn't thought about this eventuality before. And on my trip, as things worked out, the weather got better, the headwind relented. I was able to land in Mackenzie with sufficient reserves. But you wonder how silly you'd feel running out of gas just short of the airport with a bunch of gas in the back of the plane.
Right. It's how often do you have to think to yourself, how do I get the gas out of the back into the tank?
Right.
Yeah.
So I think moving on from the trench, we ought to talk a little bit about the coastal route. And again, I think actually, Dave, you ought to give the summary of your most recent trip along that route, just as at least one approach to.
Okay. Well, I've flown the coastal route twice in single-engine GA airplanes, and both times the weather was magnificent. There was hardly a cloud in sight. The winds were light. There was no icing whatsoever. It was ideal conditions, and never had a stressful moment. You can see the mountains that border the trench go right down to the water in places. So the places to landing options are pretty minimal. Off-airport landing options. There are plenty of airports on Vancouver Island and some of the other islands along the way. Mm-hmm. These Cirrus photos were taken about 10 p.m. near the summer solstice. So you do have plenty of daylight in the summertime. Running out of light is not a consideration in middle to late June.
Mm-hmm. So actually, if we can look at that last slide again for just a second. Essentially, this route, you're flying along some waterways through Southeast, the so-called inside passage that the cruise ships run up. There is terrain along the route, both on the mainland side and on the ocean side of what you're going to be looking at. But you do have a big coastal range immediately to the right of your route of flight, which is again blocking. If you think, well, if I don't like the coast, I'll just turn and go inland. No, you probably won't. There are only a couple places that there are watersheds that come through it that you could use that as an escape path. So you are flying through some serious terrain in a marine environment that are things to take into your account. And again, I think most people, at least that I've talked to, that do fly this route, one of their objectives, other than to enjoy the spectacular scenery, is to avoid the whole going into Canada and then back into the U.S., so you're dealing with customs twice. There certainly are Canadian airports that you can land along the way, but I think most people are actually trying to do it in one hop so they can avoid that whole process.
One piece of advice on when you're flying the coastal route is bring your passport anyway. Mm-hmm. If you can have your passport in your pocket, it makes it makes landing in Canada and then clearing customs a lot less complicated. And it's a much smaller deal to confront if you've got that passport in your pocket, and they're pretty understanding about, hey, the weather was bad, I was having a mechanical issue. It's like, by all means, it's like, don't run out of gas, or don't
Nobody wants you to kill yourself.
have a forced landing.
Exactly.
It's like, just do the right thing, land at an airport. It's like, it's not going to cause a major international incident. It sure beats the alternatives. And there's at least one case that I know about where a pilot was really trying to stretch his endurance, and and ran out of gas, and it was a fatal accident. And it's like don't do that. There's no need to do that. Canada is an ally. they're friends of ours, and it's like I've had some fairly unpleasant interactions with our own customs officials. Our own AOPA system is burdensome and confusing, and the people who are enforcing it at the TSA are not the most friendly Americans I have ever met. Mm-hmm. But still, they're especially flying light GA airplanes, the situation is understandable if you have to make an unplanned landing.
Good to know. I mean, we've talked in our Pilot Information Center with many pilots who go through the calculus of, do I want to do the overflight for the sake of convenience, or do I want to have the option to stop in Canada, as far as, options for safety. And, we never like to push the idea of, well, if you can do it in one shot, do it. Be prepared is what I'm hearing.
And actually, that leads us into talking about just customs briefly, and want to remind people that in this day and age, you have to file an AOPA's report when you leave the country, in addition to before you enter it, and that when you're entering the country, not only do you file the AOPA's report, but then you need to call the port of entry, the location you're actually going to be landing, to clear customs. And it was reinforced a couple of weeks ago at a meeting in Montana that you need to study the hours of operation of that port of entry and make sure that some of them will allow you to come in anytime in a 24-hour period, but you have to have called them during their business hours to arrange for a late arrival. Mm-hmm. So you definitely want to do your homework on that. If you just show up saying, well, I filed an AOPA's report and that's it, they won't be happy, and you may be facing a $5,000 fine. So those are details to make sure you review before you launch on this trip.
Right, and just true confession, I did that. I mean, it's like I filed my AOPA's, I filed an IFR flight plan. I was talking to ATC on the entire route. I was going to the U.S. Customs destination during their business hours, and when I got there, it's like I was really surprised that they were surprised. They were not expecting me, and they were pretty damn ugly about it. But it's like I had neglected to call them from Canada. I filed the AOPA's, and you get this very, very nice, almost instant email response that they've got they've received your AOPA's, and everything seems to be in order. But as Tom mentions, don't forget that last step of calling them to let them know you're coming, even though it seems like they should know.
Yep. And actually, add one other thing. The email that you receive when you file both the outbound and the inbound trip, you want to save that for a period of time. We know of at least one instance where a gentleman flew back to Alaska from the States, got to Alaska, and some number of weeks later got a notice from from Customs saying, well, you failed to file your outbound AOPA's, and we're going to fine you $5,000. Fortunately, he went to his email, pulled up the email that confirmed that he'd filed it and sent it to him, and the whole issue went away. But without that email, he'd have been in a world of hurt. So save your email messages for a good period of time just to prove that you actually filed the report. It doesn't happen very often, but things do happen.
Right, and just to reiterate, it's like the problems are on the U.S. side of the border. They're on our side. The Canadians are great with this. They are so easy to deal with and so pleasant. And it's I just I know that AOPA is working very closely with our own homeland office that to improve GA trans-border travel. And we've got a lot of work to do in that area, but we're getting some promising signs that this system that it now is so cumbersome and really forces pilots to factor it into their flight planning decisions in such a big way that we can simplify this and improve it, and hopefully in the future it won't be so burdensome.
Right. I mean, I can't even remember what's the time tolerance on your EAPIS for crossing the border?
Well, the time tolerance, they ask you what time you're going to cross the border and what time you're going to arrive at your destination airport. But frankly, as long as you're flying in the same day as your report files, those times don't make any difference.
Good to
The
know.
time you call the port of entry and tell them you're going to arrive, that you need to pay attention to, and the standard tolerance is plus or minus 15 minutes, I believe, which again is another reason that I would encourage you to clear customs as soon as you possibly can when crossing a border. Get that off your plate so you're not being influenced in terms of your weather making decisions from there on to whether you got a customs requirement to work on. So I guess now we're going to talk about heading back to the U.S. and there are just a couple details on each of those routes that I think we ought to touch on very briefly, because sometimes coming the other direction is different from the outbound trip. So and we'll kind of, I guess, burn through that in one stint. But the first one would be along the Alcan border, and again, I think we have a slide that kind of illustrates that. Actually, you want to introduce the airplane?
Oh, that was the Husky I flew from Southwest Alaska down to Texas and through the trench route.
And this is a Scoop Lake, a place on the trench, and this is a typical view looking down the trench. In terms of the trip back, this is one of our AOPA members made this exact trip. This is a departure out of Ketchikan Airport. He didn't have as nice a VFR day. I mean, it's still VFR. And again, this is looking down to point out that there's no nice beach here to land on. And so getting wheels back on the ground in Bellingham was I think quite an accomplishment for a nonstop trip that avoided the need to enter
right. And
customs.
as you see from the Grumman, it's like you don't need a super plane to do this trip. To fly in Alaska and to do this trip, it's like I've done it in a Citabria, in a Husky, in a Cirrus. They're all very capable airplanes, but they're by no means multi-engine turbojets. You don't need you can do this. You can. Flying in Alaska is a great adventure, and the journey is part of that adventure, and it can be done, quite reasonably in the standard sort of non-turbocharged, non-pressurized GA airplanes that we're so accustomed to in the lower 48.
So I think that kind of covers the route section of things. I guess one other, before we go to questions, one other detail on crossing borders, while the Canadians are great to deal with customs, they are a little more restrictive on the transport of firearms. So if you're planning to bring a firearm on your trip to and from Alaska, you want to do some homework on that front. They don't like handguns at all, and short-barreled rifles. And the other thing that was brought up in a conversation again recently is if you're taking your own guns out of the U.S. through Canada and then bringing them back later, you might want to stop at customs on the way out and get them to give you a piece of paper that indicates that you're leaving with these firearms, so they don't accuse you of importing them when you return. So just do your homework, especially with the Canadian regulations, before you casually show up in Canada with a firearm on board.
Right, and I brought a shotgun on the Husky trip, and it was a little more complicated in the fact that it wasn't my own rifle. But I had a letter from the owner with the serial number on it saying that I had permission to transport this rifle. And when you get to Canada, they'll ask you if you've got any firearms. You declare that you have this weapon, You pay, in my case, I think it was a $35 tax. They give you a form that says that you paid the tax, and then when you get to the U.S., they're going to be checking up to make sure that you declared the weapon in Canada and that you have that tax form.
So again, don't throw the paperwork away.
Yeah. All right. Did you want to say anything about survival gear and maybe how that changes depending on which route you're on?
I think all routes, I think the point in general is you should carry survival gear with you. The state of Alaska has a statute requiring certain survival equipment, sleeping bags, etc. The Canadians also have regulations. I wouldn't worry so much about the substance, but the notion is you may have to put down somewhere and you may have to hold up for several days waiting on weather to continue to go. You ought to have equipment that you are familiar with to be comfortable. And that's just with a weather delay. Now, if actually you have an engine failure or something that actually puts you on the ground unexpectedly, now you're in a full-blown survival situation, and so you ought to have equipment to deal with that.
Yeah,
and
personal locator, beacon, food and water, clothing. And just another true confession, I was flying the light GA airplane, and I expected to follow the highway route, and I just thought, well, shoot, I'm on the highway route. This is a very civilized way to go. I am not going to be terribly exposed. I'm going to take minimum survival gear, and then a series of
Unfortunate events.
Well, it's like a series of what seemed like good ideas at the time led me to this completely different place where it's like, okay, shifted. I'm going to fly the coastal route. Now I'm in Juneau. Weather's bad to the south. Going to hop over the mountains and get back to the inland route. And it's like, wow, how did I get here? I am in this wildly remote area, not talking to anybody on the radio, not on anybody's radar, and have minimal survival gear in the plane. So it's like, even if you plan to follow the highway, and even if you plan to be in not terribly remote areas on the route, pack as if you were, because you can easily get there. And even another trip was following the highway, and it was unusual summer weather in that there were thunderstorms, and there were isolated but pretty intense thunderstorms that happened to be following the highway route. They were just right over the highway, and to avoid the weather, it wasn't terribly hard to do. You just deviate to the east, but one deviation and then another and another, and it's like, man, I am in a very remote area, even though I'm following the highway route, but it's like I'm way out of, I'm 30, 40 miles east of the highway. I'm way beyond visual range, and I'm feeling pretty exposed again. So bring your comfort blankie and bring your sleeping bags, bring mosquito nets. The bugs can be pretty ferocious, and so Tom's point about being ready to spend some time outdoors unplanned. That's what you need to have, and you need to be able to notify people. And we talked about ELTs as a result of the Boggs accident. We've got much better equipment now when it comes to personal locator beacons, satellite messengers, satellite phones. Yep. Those things would be great to have along.
And hopefully someday, if we haven't already, we'll do a segment just on survival gear. But the other thing just in general to think about is differentiate your survival gear from the camping equipment that's in the back of the airplane that if you're lucky you'll get access to. But if you end up in the water or some other place where the airplane is no longer with you, it's the stuff you're going to have in your pockets and or on your person that you escape the airplane with is your survival gear. So you want to think about what's on your person in addition to what's maybe in the back of the airplane that maybe you will or won't be able to get access to, which is where things like survival vests that have kind of basic signaling devices, an ELT or a PLB or an in-reach satellite tracking device, some fire starting, things like that on you as you fly is a very good thing to do.
Yeah, and the Alaska pilots are masters at fitting a bunch of really sophisticated stuff in a vest. You know, and that vest, as Tom said, it's on their person. When they're out of the airplane, that stuff is with them, because you know, you just can't count on having access to things that are stuffed deep in the baggage compartment.
Great point. All right.
That's all I got.
Okay. All right. Well, Tom and Dave, thanks so much for taking this time to educate our members on the literal ins and outs of getting to Alaska. And to our viewers, thanks so much for joining us as well. If you have any questions as part of your membership, you can contact our Pilot Information Center staff Monday through Friday at 800 USA AOPA. That's 800-872-2672. And you can email your questions to us at pilotassist@aopa.org. And don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel just below the video. And don't forget to check out the AOPA website for a variety of resources at www.aopa.org. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.